Hormones. We blame them for everything. Mood swings, pimples, bad days, rage moments, the urge to go up to the girl and ask her for her phone number, you name it. Hormones, we blame them for everything. And what are hormones? Well, it turns out that they are little tiny chemical messengers in our body, and we blame them sometimes for controlling us and our actions. Well, is that scientific at all? So in this chapter, we're going to take a closer look at what hormones are. And maybe we'll see that they're not that bad after all, and they're actually quite important for the proper functioning of our body. So in this video, we'll be looking at what are hormones, what are these endocrine glands, where are hormones produced, and how are the levels of hormones controlled in our body. So if you need to refer to your textbook, here are the pages to look at. So what do hormones do? Well, hormones help to coordinate growth, development, and activities within an organism. So in frogs, for example, there is a hormone called thyroxine, and scientists were interested to see what it did. So what they did, they got some tadpoles, and they introduced high levels of thyroxine into the tadpole, maybe by injection or some other means. And they found that if you introduce a very high level of thyroxine, it would cause the tadpole to undergo metamorphosis to become a frog. So they tried it with very, very young tadpoles, right? So a few days old. They gave these very young tadpoles a high level of thyroxine, and they realized that it caused these tadpoles to prematurely become tiny little frogs, right? So because it was premature, they became frogs, but they were much smaller than what would normally happen. So in this case, they saw that thyroxine helps to coordinate the growth of frogs, right? A high level of it triggers metamorphosis. Now, hormones also help to coordinate development in organisms, and I'm sure all of you have experienced this very personally, that at the age of about 14 or 15, your body starts to undergo changes, which we call puberty. And that's due to the production of testosterone in males and estrogen in females. And your body suddenly has a spike in those hormone levels, which cause it to undergo drastic changes. And finally, hormones help to also coordinate the activities that take place inside an organism. So we've already seen this in the topic of homeostasis. We saw how the hormones glucagon and insulin are used to regulate and maintain the blood sugar or blood glucose level in our blood. So hormones also help to coordinate these conditions and activities inside an organism. So what exactly are hormones, and how can we define them? Well, hormones are chemical substances which are produced by an endocrine gland. So an example of an endocrine gland is the pancreas. And the pancreas contains many endocrine cells. Now these endocrine cells they synthesize hormones, and they secrete them directly into the bloodstream. So a good example of a hormone that's produced by the pancreas is insulin. So here insulin is being produced and it's being secreted into the bloodstream. Right, so the hormones are then transported in the bloodstream, as seen in the diagram, to target organs. Now there may be only one target organ, or there may be several target organs. And it's at these target organs where the hormones exert their effects. So here, let's follow it. Insulin is transported in the bloodstream until it reaches the target organs, in this case the liver and the muscle cells. And then insulin will then move out of the bloodstream into the tissue fluid. It will bind to receptors on the target cells, and this would trigger changes within the target cell. For instance, it would change the permeability of these cells to glucose. And finally, once the hormones have finished performing their function, they are transported to the liver and destroyed and broken down there. And that's important because you do not want such high levels of any given hormone in your blood at any one point in time. You just want it for a certain time to complete its function, and then we destroy it. So we've just learned that hormones are secreted by endocrine glands. But what exactly is an endocrine gland? Well, to explain that, we first need to understand that there are two types of glands in the body. The first type of gland is called an exocrine gland, and the second type is called the endocrine gland. So let's see the difference. Now, to see the difference, it will be helpful to look at an organ that contains both exocrine and endocrine glands. And that, fortunately, we find one in the pancreas. So here's our pancreas, and we're going to take a cross section here. And if you look on in this direction, you will see something that looks like this. So in the pancreas, we see both exocrine glands and endocrine glands. So what's an exocrine gland? Well, an exocrine gland is a gland that secretes substances into a duct. Right? A duct is essentially a tube, a duct, and then that duct then carries the secretion away. So for example, in the pancreas, the exocrine glands would produce your pancreatic enzymes, pancreatic juice, and secrete that into the pancreatic duct, and the pancreatic duct will then carry those enzymes and juice away into the small intestine. And another example of an exocrine gland is your sweat gland, because the sweat gland secretes sweat into the sweat duct. So exocrine glands have ducts. Alright. On the other hand, the endocrine glands do not have ducts. Endocrine glands are ductless glands that secrete substances directly into the bloodstream. So for example, in the pancreas, we find endocrine glands in the islets of Langerhans. So in the islets of Langerhans, we find cells which secrete substances directly into the bloodstream. So what's an endocrine gland? It is a ductless gland that secretes hormones directly into the blood. So we've looked at what hormones do and what hormones are. Now one final point to make is that hormone levels need to be carefully regulated in our body. Now if there's under or overproduction of any hormone, it might lead to problems in growth and development in the organism. So here's an example of something that happens when the hormone levels are not carefully regulated. There's this condition called goiter, and it's found in people where the thyroid hormones are either over or underproduced. Now these thyroid hormones are important to regulate metabolic rate, or the rate of respiration in our body cells. And for some reason, they develop this growth in their thyroid region. The thyroid gland actually swells up, and they have this condition called goiter. Now for those of you who also are into gymming and stuff, you might also know that some people take steroid hormones to bulk themselves up. Right? So hormones can also be used to artificially alter the body. So an artificial increase in steroid hormones, for example testosterone, can lead to rather interesting, or I would think strange, physiques. So we need to carefully regulate the hormone levels in our body, or it might lead to consequences to growth and development. So since hormone production needs to be carefully controlled, how is it done in the body? Well, there's two main ways. The first way is that hormone production can be controlled by the nervous system, and the second way is that it can be controlled by other hormones. So let's first take a look at how it might be controlled by the nervous system. Now in fact, we've already seen an example of this before. When we were talking about osmoregulation, we talked about the hypothalamus being the control center. And the hypothalamus, when it detects, let's say, the water potential of the blood increasing above the norm or decreasing below the norm, it stimulates the pituitary gland to release antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. So the pituitary gland is actually being controlled by the hypothalamus, which is part of the nervous system. So what actually happens is, now if you take a look at this diagram here, this is the hypothalamus, and it contains interesting cells called neurosecretory cells. They're actually like modified neurons. So when the water potential rises above the norm or below the norm, these cells will be stimulated. They will send signals down to the pituitary gland, which is over here. So in fact, these cells will send hormones ADH will be produced in the hypothalamus and sent down to the pituitary gland to be released into the blood. So the pituitary gland is under the control of the nervous system, the hypothalamus. And the amount of hormone that is released is under control by the nervous system. So the second way that hormone production is controlled is that it can be controlled by other hormones. So an example of this is where the pituitary gland releases a hormone called the follicle-stimulating hormone. And this hormone, FSH, causes the production of estrogen by the ovaries in the female reproductive system. So what happens is that the pituitary gland releases a hormone called FSH, which then stimulates the ovaries to release a hormone called estrogen. So the levels of estrogen in the blood depend on how much FSH there is. So the level of estrogen is being controlled by the level of FSH. Right? So that's an example of how hormone production is controlled by other hormones. I'm going to stop here, and in the next video we're going to look at what are the glands, endocrine glands in our body, and what kind of hormones do they produce. And we're also going to compare the endocrine system to the nervous system.